We were thrilled that so many of you enjoyed our webinar programs in April and May, all 5 of them, that we thought we should do it again. And so we welcome you tonight, and we are going to have one in August, which will be Jeffrey Swan talking about a terrific subject, Beethoven's continuing influence on Wagner's development as a musician. And I want to assure you that we've solved the technical problems, we think, and you'll be able to hear, not only hear Jeffrey talk, but to hear him clearly illustrating his remarks with his playing the piano. So we're thrilled about that. August 6th, 7:30 p.m. We're also committed to programs in September, October, November, December. Right now, we're planning all 4 of them to be webinars. We hope you'll join us. In a week or 2, we'll get out an announcement as to the nature of the programs, but I think you're going to be very pleased by them. It's a great privilege, as always, to introduce my friend Saul Lilienstein, and particularly the subject of Wagner's music drama and the Jews. This is a wonderful lecture, and without further ado, let's start the program. April 3rd, that's Easter Saturday. We're going to start at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we're going to show you the entire ring for 16 hours. In this room or that room until midnight. No interruptions, no lectures, no bathroom breaks. Bring your food, bring your portable you-know-whats. It's free. It's open to the public. We hope you'll come for 15 minutes or 15 hours. I'm going to try to make this brief because I can't think of anything new to say about you. Or for that matter, a lot of nice things to say. Except, I think most of you know him. He has over the years been our favorite, most beloved, most knowledgeable, and what else can I say? I don't have to say anymore. The one and the only, our own Wagner Society favorite. Please give a warm welcome to Saul Lilienstein.
My first thought, listening to Jim talk about the different events coming up, that April 3rd, the 16 hours, that's like Yom Kippur. And not by accident, this talk is a talk which is a talk about Wagner and Wagner's music and the Jews. And clearly, as we're all aware, it's a controversial subject. Wagner himself has always been a controversial person and composer. You notice that the title is not Wagner and the Jews. There are certain givens that are beyond argument, which is that in his life there was a dark spirit which resided with all the rest that was in him. And it was a spirit which was filled with hatred for different peoples. Most of all for the Jews, but just about the same amount for the French, who he also hated. He hated the Jesuits as well, and wrote frequently, especially in his later years, of these elements. And so I in no way wish to whitewash that. I'm not concerned with doing that at all. That is, we accept, those of us who love Wagner know that his personal life has many elements in it which are deplorable. Now, the title, Wagner's Music and the Jews, can be interpreted 2 ways. One of them is Wagner's music and the Jewish reception to that music. And another way it can be interpreted is Wagner's music, and within it, are there elements which are Jewish? I want to address both of those during the course of this evening. And it would be simple to just separate it and say, here's the first one, and now here's the second one. But in fact, there'll probably be a spilling over between these two very different definitions as I continue. But I'd like to start with the first one, which is the reception of Wagner amongst Jewish audiences. Let's take our contemporary. Let's imagine for a moment that this room is not here, but in Israel. And we are all Jews in Israel. And a topic such as this one is being presented. It is immediately a different reaction amongst the people who are there. It would be one from me as well. I have loved Wagner's music for more than a half of a century. But if this were in Israel, and it was a discussion, among other things, about the ban on his music, I would probably say, for a little while longer, it's not a bad idea. For a little while longer, while there are still people alive who remembered when they were children and saw their parents going off to gas chambers while the music of Wagner was being played. They shouldn't have to have those kinds of memories revived for them. I understand that totally. And I agree with that. And this was, in a sense, part of it, I think we will realize. Not Wagner's doing, but a decision made by the Nazi Party in the 1930s to create an equation between their party ideals and Wagner's music, to try to do as they did with total success with the Hindu symbol of the swastika, to make that symbol of the swastika, at least in the Western world, indelibly the symbol of the Nazi Party. And to some extent, Hitler succeeded with Wagner as well. Because if he hadn't, there would be no such lecture being delivered to you today. It wouldn't be necessary, except that we realize there is an element in which he has placed the stain on something which was without that stain. He has placed it, and we are all, to some extent, prisoners of history. We can't deny the existence of the history of the last century, any more than if someone were doing a lecture, let's say, on the medieval architecture of Hiroshima. It's a very difficult lecture to do when you know that every building you show people on your slides has been destroyed. History has played, say, a bad turn on Richard Wagner. I'd like to go back in the history and see the reception of Jews before our own time. But before I do that, I mentioned us all being in Israel and how there could immediately be contention within this group here. For those who love the music, but who recognized a different value other than the value of the music. Now here is, on the other side, our contemporary group. About a month and a half ago, I was in San Francisco and I gave a lecture on Wagner to the Wagner Society of Northern California. All of our meetings, all of them are in Wagner Hall. All of their meetings are in the Jewish Community Center. There is no feeling at all that it is the wrong place for it to be. They're comfortable there, they're welcomed, and they're part of that community, as Wagner's music is part of communities all around the world. And reception of Jews, I don't think there are many places where you find meetings in the Jewish community centers. San Francisco is, we know San Francisco. But what is definitely true is that wherever we go in the world today, the audiences for Wagner always include an unusually high percentage of Jews. That Jews have always enjoyed Wagner's music, and have, at least most, have been able to make a separation between what the man has done as an artist and what in his personal life, and sometimes in his public writing, he has expressed in terms of his prejudices. So I'd like to go back in history and look first at when Wagner was a young man, in his 20s and in his 30s, and the relationship at that time, this Wagner's music and the Jews, but I can't keep it quite that limited. We have to also talk about him as a person and about the society in which he was in, how that changed and how he changed. Well, his first love was a young Jewish girl, that counts. But more importantly than that, he would say nothing is more important than that. But more importantly than that is that in a society in Dresden in the 1840s, Wagner was a member of the radical element within that society that wanted a change in government. And that element in society was filled with everyone from anarchists, socialists, royalists. It was Christians and Jews and free thinkers. Wagner was one of that group, and it is impossible even to find a letter or any indication of anything that he had written before perhaps 1850, which was anti-Semitic. That doesn't mean that he didn't harbor those thoughts. Frankly, if you grew up in Germany in the 19th century, in your mother's milk, you learned anti-Semitism. And so did Wagner. It was almost a knee-jerk reaction to people who were outsiders and people who were different than you were. His early operas, especially Tannhäuser, had an immediate reception amongst Jewish audiences wherever it was performed. A change occurs in Wagner's life in 1850. In 1850, he wrote what is perhaps the most deplorable pamphlet of his life. It was called Jewishness in Music, or Jewry in Music. And it is it's filled with all of the standard prejudices against Jews, are all listed in there, and it's really quite difficult reading. It is filled also with elements of great jealousy. He remembered his days in Paris in the late 1830s and early 1840s, when success was showered upon Meyerbeer, a Jewish composer from Germany who made his home in Paris, and Halevi, another Jewish composer. And these men were successful, while he, knowing he had more talent, found himself instead, some of the time, in debtor's prison. And that atmosphere, which gave praise to the others, not to him, fed his anti-Semitism and stirred it to a higher level. That was in 1850. In the years, I'm going to kind of continue into that period, going up to 1871. Sorry, shall I talk louder?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I don't think your mic is on.
Shall I start at the beginning?
No.
A line about Yom Kippur again?
No? It was audible, but...
I will. I'll be better. Turn on the volume?
Yes.
Turn up the volume? No, I can't turn up the volume. I will talk loud. I'll talk. Wagner was exiled from Germany, starting in 1849. He spent 12 years out of the country. And we seem to be doing okay, but stay close. Stay close.
No, we're not doing okay.
Oh, volume, more volume here too. All right? Better?
Yeah.
Better? All right, good. Much better. The most important change, we'll look at eras both in his life and in German life. The most important change comes in 1871. In 1871, Germany became a united nation. And among the things that was dictated at the time was full emancipation of the Jews. This was 1871. And the Jews loved living in Germany. For those of you who've never studied this history, that might seem as the oddest of comments, but in fact, to live as a Jew in Germany in the 1870s and the 1880s was to have more freedom than any other place on earth. Much more than in the United States, much more than in France or in England. It was in Germany after the total emancipation that Jews now became university professors, filling their lives as scientists, artists, writers for newspapers, magazines, all of the professions. The Jews were participating in this. What they were participating in was called Grundzeit, that is, this foundation of what the Germans felt was finally their new country, a united country. And the Jews felt very much a part of that. It doesn't mean there wasn't prejudices. There were always prejudices. But none of them were legally so. And so in that environment, they not only thrived, they became amongst the most patriotic of Germans. When some Germans had moved to the United States, the ones who remained, which of course were most German Jews, the ones who remained had said, and with validity, why on earth would you go to that country in which you are so discriminated against, when you can stay here and be a free German citizen? The Jews, from the much earlier in the 19th century, created the Reform movement in Germany, and it was part of an assimilation with the German culture. That is, in the Reform movement, at least at that time, they dropped Hebrew and had their service in German. That was when, instead of having a reading platform in the middle of a synagogue, it was moved as it was in the churches to a sanctuary where everyone would look in the same direction. That's when they put on robes. Before that, rabbis and cantors would dress just like other members of the congregation. Now they put on like Protestant robes to begin the service. So there were a great many elements of assimilation, which were part of the Jewish life there. But the greatest part of it was that as religion became less important, a new art, a new religion of art became more and more important. That is, it was through art, through music, mostly through music, that German Jews felt they not only achieved a freedom for themselves, but they achieved a community with the rest of the country in which they lived. And so Wagner became more and more important in this Jewish world. This Grundzeit, this whole aspect of their lives in Germany, continued with problems. I don't mean to whitewash the German world of problems, but it was truly the most liberal place for Jews. Right into the period of the First World War. Now, as an example of the First World War in Germany, the largest number of volunteers, that is in terms of percentage of the population, that volunteered to be part of the German army, were the Jews, of all the different groups in the country. The Jews had the largest percentage. The Jews had the largest percentage of decorations for valor during the First World War. The reasons for the patriotism are mixed. One of them was, it was their country. They felt as if they were Germans. Leo Beck, his name some of you know because there's an institute in New York after him, who is the most prominent of the, I have a quote from Leo Beck, he is the most prominent of the Reformed rabbis, and Leo Beck said, the life of the fatherland is our life, and its conscience resonates in our own. This was the chief Reformed rabbi of Berlin. And so this was the attitude of Germans who were Jewish in Germany during the time of, up to the time of and into the time of the First World War. There was another reason they were so patriotic. They had no love for France. France had just come through the Dreyfus trial and through the most anti-Semitic period in its modern history. They had even less love for another one of the Allies, Russia. Russia was the place that for the last 20 years had been the most murderous country of all in terms of the pogroms which caused so many Jews to leave the country. And so to be able to fight for Germany meant, among other things, to be able to fight against the Russians who have been destroying Jewish lives and communities. You can see there was a lot of reason for a feeling of patriotism amongst the Jews. In New York, which was filled with German Jews and others as well, of course, immigrants of various kinds, the love for things German, this, by the way, is way larger than New York. Lutheran churches' services were in German. Reformed Jewish services, the services were in German. That changed with the beginning of the war. But until the war, and until 1917, most of the Germans and most of the Jews were not in favor of England and France and Russia, but really were siding with Germany instead. All right. I'd like to go back to this time in New York, just before the First World War. It might even seem silly to us today how strong the Wagnerian tide was in New York. For instance, every week, 3 or 4 nights a week, in the summertime, trains and boats would go to Coney Island and Brighton Beach for Wagner concerts. Now, this is not going to happen. There was a time for this. That was the time for it, up until the beginning of the First World War. Wagner was played more than any other composer by the Philharmonic Orchestra. The performances of the Metropolitan Opera were all given in German. That is, Faust in German. Every opera was given in German. There was even a movement in Congress to make German the second language, officially the second language in America. This is that period, Grundzeit, Germany, and with this very strong German and German Jewish community in the United States. Love from Wagner, a love from Brahms, a love from Beethoven. So there's so much that feeling, and still to this very day, we don't even think of German music as ethnic music, but of course it is. Everyone's music is ethnic music. We think of German music as meat and potatoes. Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert, Wagner, Brahms. We say, oh no, it's the Russians who are giving us ethnic music. But in fact, it is because of how much we accept German music as our own that we considered it not a foreign idea, but in fact the normal what music was supposed to be. When the war is over, and there is the devastation that the Germans feel, devastation that they feel, being stabbed in the back. They didn't know they lost the war until they were told the war was over, that they lost. The fighting wasn't in Germany. The fighting was in France. The Germans continued on their regular day, more or less, during the course of the war. They weren't bombed unless you talk the occasional flight that would come over and someone would have a handheld bomb and throw it over the edge. Literally, that was the kind of bombing that the German cities experienced during the First World War. And so when the war came to an end, they tried to come up with an understanding as to what happened in their lives. Well, part of it was the Versailles Treaty, which in fact was brutal to Germany in terms of the reparations which the French in particular wanted from the Germans and destroy the German economy in trying to pay these reparations. As many of us know, we've seen the pictures of people carrying wheelbarrows filled up like this with money, which were worth absolutely nothing. That was a period that started soon after the end of the war. It lasted till around 1923 or 1924. Now, that new government which was created was foreign to German history, the Weimar Republic, a democratic government. There had never been a democratic government, at least in terms of a united Germany before. And it was a foreign element. We think, well, democracy is best for everyone. I'm not sure about that. It might have been best if the Germans were able to keep it, certainly. But it was, in a sense, a foreign element in their own cultural experience. There wasn't the kind of authority which they expected out of the government, which had always been there before. And Weimar and Berlin became synonymous with the kind of decadence of this, this new world where money meant nothing anymore. And the new works which started to be produced in Germany, an opera like Wagner, truly, to them at least, a decadent opera, then Three-Penny Opera. Before that, Mahagoni, the Singspiel, Mahagoni by Brecht and Weil, all these things that seem to be breaking down order in the world. But where could they find, where could now, let's say, this nationalist element within the German world, where could they find something that was like that old world, the world that they knew? In 1924, Bayreuth began again. And Bayreuth began again with Cosima trying to keep it exactly as it was when her husband was alive. And so Bayreuth became a symbol for the right wing in Germany. It had not been in this fashion before, at least not like this. And you see, are you with me here? And you see how suddenly this world is dividing between the Weimar Republic and Berlin on one side of it, and on the other side, truly, Bayreuth becoming the symbol of what was valuable and true and echt, pure German. By the time it had opened, 1924, the year before that, Cosima and her son Siegfried and Winifred, daughter-in-law, all had made the acquaintance of Adolf Hitler and had been swept up in the charisma of Hitler's movement. Hitler was the one who then created for himself with Bayreuth that connection between himself and Wagner. And so a new period has begun that starts not with the Nazis taking over in 1933, but from 1923, 1924, that's when this new and pernicious period takes over in German artistic and political history, the way those two can be wrapped together. And that continues, and of course explodes into perhaps the worst decade or so in modern history. The Holocaust, the destruction of so many lives, and an indelible stain, not fair, indelible stain that some people always feel, find in Wagner militarism. Very hard to find militarism in Wagner. There's one scene in Lohengrin, but even that scene in Lohengrin, those of you who know the opera know that Henry the Fowler, when he gathers all the German troops together, he's gathering together to protect the homeland from the invading Hungarians. And that's the militant scene in Lohengrin. There is no other militant scene in Wagner. I mean, I'm not counting Rienzi, because I don't count Rienzi. Who counts for it? How many of you have seen a production of Rienzi in the last 10 years? Well, you can count Rienzi, but the rest of us aren't going to. Where was I? Before I got all complaining about you and Rienzi. What? That's right. There simply is no militarism in Wagner. We're going to see a little bit later a scene which some people think of as military, and the Nazis used it that way, but in fact is quite totally the opposite. Now, a new era began after the end of the Second World War. And it has been an era of revisionism, in which people now look, trying to find what is a reason, how could this have happened in our world? How could a Holocaust have happened? How could 7 million, 6 million Jews, 1 million Gypsies, 17 million Russians, millions and millions of people, how could all this happen? And then looking for reasons, going beyond the reasons of the era itself, looking back at German history, looking for signs of anti-Semitism. Now they come upon again Wagner, not as an artist, but as a polemist, and his personal views about Judaism, and blaming Wagner for the sins of an era which did not begin until after he was gone. Amongst the most important revisionists, some names I'm sure you know, Theodor Thorn is the first one. His major work was written in 1949, and he's followed in more recent times by Wagner, Paul Lawrence Rose. How many of you, when I mention these names, how many of these names are familiar to some of you? And there are Barry Millington, who is well known and a Wagner scholar, but he is part of the revisionist movement as well. Robert Gutman, the author of a highly respected biography of Wagner, is part of it as well. And the revisionism has taken a new turn. It started immediately. Revisionism, it's not just that Wagner was an anti-Semite. I knew that. It's that the anti-Semitism is in the music. And it's embedded within the music dramas themselves. There was one man named Helmut Zielinski who insisted that every Wagner opera is about anti-Semitism. On the other side of this, we have those who refute the revisionists. They are Father Olin Lee, Brian McGee, before the two of them, Ernest Newman, Michael Tanner, and various other very respected people. What I'd like to do, as I continue, is look at those elements which they say, here's the evidence, and look with you at that supposed evidence of anti-Semitism in his music. The thing is that you might decide after you hear some of these examples and you say, well, maybe there is something. Maybe there is an element, maybe there is a taint in this music. And I'm not going to deny, for instance, in the part of Mima, that the taint might exist. But what I'd like you to do is measure it against other 19th century artists. Charles Dickens, the character, Fagin, David Copperfield. Some of you might know or know of a novel by Du Maurier called Trilby. It's not really about Trilby, it's really about the evil Jew who controls Trilby, named Svengali. That's who that work is really about. And here are works which were, from beginning to end, filled with hatred for Jewish characters on the stage, in drama and in literature. The 19th century is filled with them. At its worst, we might see Wagner looking at it, and then moving away. Now, the work which, I'm going to start with, the work which Hitler used as the prototype of the German nation in music, and that was the opera Die Meistersinger. And Die Meistersinger used to be performed regularly on the anniversary of the formation of the Nazi Party. It was in all theaters around Germany. They would perform Meistersinger on occasions like that. In Berlin in 1933, with Hitler sitting in the royal box, when they got to that moment in the last act, and walked out, magnificent chorus, everyone on the stage turned and looked at the Führer and sang it to him in this fashion. So it was this intense connection between the opera and Nazism. And there's one character in it who was considered a Jewish caricature by the Revisionists, Beckmaster. Now, what I'd like to do, we're going to look at his music. We're going to look at his famous serenade and see what's in it. But first, I'd like to show some slides. Could you turn that on? I'd like to show some slides of Beckmaster, how he's been treated in history. Okay? Does that work? I've got to do it here. I've got to do it. Okay, well, it's a little faint with the lights on, but can you see it or not barely? Can you dim the lights? We're going to have to dim the lights for a while. I think it'll be better. Okay, this is the original costuming for Beckmaster. 1868, the opera year. There are different early pictures of Beckmaster. A dumb fellow is portrayed as dumb and, just trying hard. All through these early years, that's what we're looking at. This is turn of the century Beckmaster. When the opera premiered, there was some objection about Beckmaster. The reason for it was not that people heard anything Jewish in the music, but it was generally known that Wagner had originally called Beckmaster White Hanslick. He named him after Hanslick, the critic, who who hated his music. And Beckmaster was meant as a parody of someone like Hanslick, who was mean-spirited, or at least as Wagner saw him, and rejecting all new things in art, and only wanting all of the old rules to be in place. The thing is that, Wagner changed the name. That would have been a foolish thing to leave it. Called him Beckmaster instead. The thing is that Hanslick's mother was Jewish. And, Hanslick's mother converted when she got married, and Hanslick grew up as a Catholic and was a practicing Catholic his entire life, never thought of himself as Jewish. But there were members of the audience who felt that Wagner, in parodying Hanslick, was in fact doing a parody against the Jews at the same time. But as you'll notice in all of these, this is from the early 20th century now, and all of these depictions of Beckmaster, he's a comic. We've usually seen in comic poses of one kind or another. He sings again with the girl. He's even sweet in this portrayal. Singing his heart out, poor guy. This is in the 1930s in Germany. Hans Sachs and Hanslick, and Beckmaster in the second act. Here's an interesting one. This is from 1933 or 1934 in Germany. It's all of Meister's hymns. Well, which one is Hanslick? The Germans had, in the Nazis, in other words, the Nazis had no idea of portraying Hanslick as a Jew. They're all Germans. There's no caricature here. When did we find Beckmaster being portrayed as a Jew? In the Revisionist period, starting in 1949. Now we find a sinister Hanslick in the 1949 production. This would have been unheard of before. And ultimately, here he is. Now you notice we have in this drawing someone who probably they fixed up his nose a little bit like that, or that was being given a Jewish nose. Honestly, as a Jew, is an idea of the revisionist world, rather than anything that was in Wagner's mind. In fact, Wagner, we can turn that off. I'm going to read something that Wagner wrote. It's part of a very, anti-Semitic comment. I will turn it off. All right. Don't turn it on and off, because that's when I'm going to lose a bulb. Let's leave it like that for a while. Okay. I read in the dark? Of course I can read in the dark. There's no problem reading in the dark. Three different comments that I would find interesting about this. There's a professor named David Dennis. He's at the University of Chicago, I believe, professor of history, and he's done a lot of work for me. Thank him. The work that he did was that he went through all of the archives of the most pernicious sources. Here's what he found. No mention of Beckmaster as a Jewish character in the 60 years of the Bayreuth letter. You know that was the official organ of Bayreuth. In the entire writings of major anti-Semites, from H.S. Chamberlain to Joseph Goebbels, in over 300 articles on Wagner in the official Nazi newspapers, in all the anti-Semitic diatribes of German writers from 1868 straight through to the Nazi era, no one found Beckmaster a Jewish character. The revisionists see Jewish character all through his art. Now, I'd like to mention one element in it in which you could say this is brought out by Barry Millington, which is interesting and has to be seen. In the first act, there's a scene in the first, Walter is singing his prize, his trial song, and Beckmaster is back there indicating all of the mistakes. It's wonderful to be able to talk to a group of Wagnerians who know everything that I'm talking about when I say it. And, I could call out numbers and you'd say, oh, that's right. An old story about telling jokes. You only tell the numbers. And somebody says, number 72, nobody laughs, or you told it wrong. But, it is, that element here, which is really quite wonderful, which is, I say, in the first act, in the trial song, Walter is singing, Beckmaster is marking, in the middle of it, Walter gets really upset, and he starts improvising, and he says, his song is about spring, and he says, winter is like, winter is hiding in a thorn bush, and screeching owls are hiding in this thorn bush, trying to destroy the spring. But, he goes back into his song, but they cannot do it. He goes back into his song about spring. Now, there is a grim fairy tale called Der Jude im Thorn, the Jew in the Thorns. And the story of the Jew in the Thorns is of a peasant who's, a good German peasant, and he has, I won't go into how he gets it, but he gets a magic violin, and he plays the magic violin while the Jew is inside the thorns looking for a bird, and he plays on the magic violin, and the Jew has to dance and gets all of his clothes torn because of it, and the peasant says, good, that'll pay you back for stealing our money. All of the story goes on in various ways that I don't go into now. That's Jude im Thorn. Did Wagner know that? He probably did. It was never one of the major stories, but he probably knew it. And he has this, the phrase begins, in winter in der Dornhecke, in the thorn bushes. Winter is there in the thorn bushes. And so, Millington, on that basis, with that as his evidence, says the role is a caricature of Jews and an anti-Semitic role. Paul Lawrence Rose and Mark Wiener go much further. They say that the music is a parody of Jewish cantorial music. Here's the beginning of, can you see this, or is this in the way?
We can see.
Can you all see music here? Bum, 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 ba-da-dum, dee, bum, bum. We all know this Beckmaster song. And then the next section, which is the conclusion of the song. Now, here's a matter of what Mr. Wagner says and Mr. Grove say, and that's their opinion. Their opinion is wrong. I mean, they're just absolutely wrong. I spent 30 years and more directing synagogue choirs. I have performed with every imaginable cantor who's come through the Northeast area, and the synagogue in which I worked had a Viennese tradition. We did Viennese music, we did German music from Berlin, we did German music from Hamburg. That was the heart of this style. I know that entire repertoire. There isn't anything that any Jewish cantor ever sang that sounds like Beckmaster's music. When Mark Wagner says it in the book, he's just simply out and out wrong. Now, I'd like to play it. Let's see if I can now get this thing working. Here we go. I've got a long time without playing music. Have you ever noticed that my lectures, they're always filled with music, and here instead I've been talking all this time? But now we're in the second half, which is looking for that which is evidence, or supposedly evidence of, in his music dramas, a Jewish element within his music dramas. I want to take the toughest of the cases. The ones, in other words, the ones in which people complain about. Meister Singer and The Ring of the Needle. Those are the two, and those are the ones I'm concentrating on. Here we go. Serenade, which, by the way, I really love. I think it happens to be written in a perfect bar form that is the form of the Meister song, Meister Lied at the time, and with each repeat of it, the music becomes more and more interesting. Here's one of the repeats. Basically says, give me a chance to sing it. Give me a chance to sing it. He says to Hans Sachs, who's been marking with his hammer every mistake. Here's another verse. Think for a moment how ridiculous it is to imagine Beckmaster as a Jewish character. First of all, he's a town clerk. That doesn't mean it's like being a clerk at a grocery store. Wolfgang Wagner said that the town clerk in Munich in the Middle Ages was the highest police authority in Nuremberg. He was in charge of all the records books. Here he goes once a week, or however often it is, the Meister Singers meet in a church. That's where they meet. He is not only a respected member of the group, he convinces everyone except Hans Sachs that Wagner isn't worth listening to. So he's not only respected, he's given a musical authority as well. He wants to, as they all know, he wants to win the girl for himself. The nice, blonde, German maid. He's Jewish, and all of this can go by, and all of this can be allowed in medieval Nuremberg. It's nonsense to imagine that he's... Okay, the phrase that they felt was imitating a Jewish sound. It's not Jewish at all. It doesn't use any of the intervals which you find in it. And in fact, the next piece that Wagner wrote was Siegfried, and he loved those same intervals, and he uses them. The climax of the Siegfried here is the same musical idea of the descending fourths. Here's what Hanslick said about this Siegfried duet. He hated Siegfried also. He said, the duet falls off lamentably towards the end through the inexplicable introduction of a stiff theme in descending fourths. Descending fourths. Okay? It's like we have them there. These exalted accents of which Wagner is so proud, the passionate groaning and moaning, border offensively on the limits of a flaming, insatiable sensuality. That is Hanslick's comment about what we're going to hear. If this music, maybe they're both Jewish. I'm going to get back to that. But just for now, let's say that the real authority on whether or not Beckmaster was Jewish or any of his other characters are is Wagner himself. In 1850, in the midst of that work called Der Judentum in Musik, Jewishness in Music, he wrote the following. He's very anti-Semitic comment, but it's interesting what he says. He says, the Jew in ordinary life strikes us primarily by his outward appearance, which, no matter to what European nationality we belong, has something disagreeably foreign to that nationality. Coming to its bearings upon art, we here will merely observe that to us, this exterior can never be thinkable as a subject for the art of representment. We can conceive no representation of an antique or modern stage character by a Jew. These are Wagner's words about it. Now you can say, as George Bernard Shaw did, George Bernard Shaw said, Wagner could be quoted against himself without limit. And so, but these are in fact his words, and when he reprinted the article in 1869, he reprinted the article, did not change any of that at all. But the reprint had in it was an attack on Hanslick, in 1869, he said, Hanslick is leading a cabal of Jewish writers against me. That was basically the point of him, updating his article. It was as deplorable as publishing it in the first place. And there is, none of us would forgive him for that. But I would like to now look at the other element in Marxism, which was, by Hitler's design, became the prime moment of nationalist socialism, the moment in which his entire audience would stand up and indicate a Sieg Heil while the music was going on. And it is a total distortion of the scene. It's the last scene in the opera. Here's what happens, and I know you know what happens, but I'd like to go into things about the text, because there's an element in this in which one can say, Wagner could have gone in another direction. Walter has just won the prize. He sung beautifully. The people tell Poland, Ava's father, to give, the mantle of the society, the master singers, to Walter. Walter refuses. He refuses to take this honor. He remembers how badly he was treated by these people. So the last scene begins as Hans Sachs gives him a lesson. He says, don't disparage these masters. We're old-fashioned people. He says, we're old-fashioned, we have our ways, but we're holding the tradition together. We're holding the tradition together in a time when, and he's talking about the time of the 30 Years' War, where the German language and culture is all falling apart. Swedes are coming down. He doesn't say these words. I'm adding these on. Swedes are coming down from the north. The French are coming in from the west. Croatians and Italians are coming up from the south. The language is being corrupted. The music is being corrupted. And Hans Sachs says, be careful. Watch out. These are dangerous elements which are so corrupting our country's art that soon a prince and his people won't even know each other's language. So what is German and is pure, we wouldn't know anymore unless we honor our meisters, unless we honor these people who are preserving our art. And that is the message which Hans Sachs delivers in this final scene. The message which the Nazis chose to look at as a moment of, in fact, Aryan purity above all other peoples. They even ignored the fact that it was the opposite of militarism, because Hans Sachs says to Walter, he says, we're honoring you. It's not because of how good you are in your sword or your noble birth. We're honoring you because of your talents. That's what matters. The whole Roman Empire could fall apart, but we can preserve our German art. That's what matters. That concept of Kultur, German Kultur, you say, is Wagner addressing the audience of his own time? Absolutely, he's addressing it. He's saying this Kultur, Goethe, Beethoven, and me, this Kultur has to be protected and honored. And this is the message of this final scene. And one can look at that and say, well, that's very nationalistic. Well, it is. It is nationalistic. Take a look at some of the operas of Verdi and see how nationalistic they are. Think about what, within a few years, what everyone was dancing to and marching to in the United States. Music of John Philip Sousa. We talk about nationalism. Nationalism was what the late 19th century and early 20th century was about. Wagner is part of that. But this nationalism is love, not of the military, not of the government, it's the love of culture. That's what Hans Sachs is seeing. Here's the scene. Before we watch the scene, I'd like us to take a look at some of the vision of it. Well, first, this is a woodcut of old Nuremberg from the 15th century. city, and just outside the city was this, grounds, a reason in which there would be festivals. And festivals like this would occur all over Germany. Folk fests, part filled with myth, filled with song, always filled with song. There's Nuremberg in the background, you might be able to see it there. This one. And it continued here in the late 19th century. There's an indoor, one of these Sängerbund events where everyone is singing. Entire city filled with people who are singing. Look at this from 1912. On the left side are the modern people from 1912. Who are they greeting? They're greeting Hans Sachs and the people of the 16th century. It was the height of Grundenzeit, the height of this feeling of one continuing, developing culture. Here are from early productions, in fact, painting from the first production, 1868. Nuremberg in the background, Walter singing, crowds of people. There's another element in Meistersinger that somehow the Nazis missed totally. It's a work that consoles democracy. It's part of a series that you could say begins with Mozart, where moving away from fine music being the providence of aristocratic setting, Mozart gives us concertos in cafes, restaurants, and in open-air situations in the parks around Vienna. It continues with Beethoven, and clearly in his Ninth Symphony, speaking to all humanity in this fashion. And it goes right into Meistersinger. There's a moment in the first act where they're arguing. All the Meisters are arguing about this or that, and whether Beethoven's idea of having his daughter, be given in marriage to whoever wins the contest. And Hans Sachs says, why don't we let the people decide? And the other Meisters say, what? Let the people decide? And so, of course, that idea is voted down. But in fact, what happens in this final scene, when they say, before the scene we're going to be watching here, before they say, Meister Wagner, give the prize to this young man, Walter. In fact, it is the people who have made that decision. All right, let me go ahead with a few of these. These are early idyllic scenes. The final section of Meistersinger. Now what I'd like to do is show what the setting looked like starting in 1927 in Nuremberg. This is the 1927 setting. And we see the kind of Nazi architecture look to the scene. Back again for 1 second, what we had before. Now the background of Nuremberg is what you'll find in both of these. Somewhere way in the background is the town of Nuremberg. The settings have changed. You get into the 1930s, and this becomes the setting for the joy of the last scene in the opera. In other words, if they're going to make it a Nazi event, they've got to change the scenery as well. On some of these slides, which I do not have, one sees Nazi flags displayed. One after the other. Barren of humanity. This looks like it's another setting, but it isn't. It's Albert Speer's architecture for the grandstands and the parade grounds in Nuremberg. It's 1937. Speer designed this after those productions of Meistersinger. And one gets the feeling that he is inspired by Hitler's view of Meistersinger in the creation of his own work. But we can't leave with that. Let's take a look at something from Vienna in the 1980s, like that, where again, there's restored the charm and the good spirit with which this opera was written. All right, now we're going to follow the scene. This is we're going to watch the entire last scene, which is Hans Sachs' address, people's reaction to it, and this is in the Metropolitan Opera production of James Barnes. All right.
Der Wagen wird
piece of music as anyone can deserve. Boy, now I want to take on Mima. I want to take on Mima. Gustav Mahler said that Mima was a Jewish character. Now, Gustav Mahler might have been right. He also was a self-hating Jew. I mean, among the things that Mahler said was, he said, let's see if I have this right, he says, with Mima, Wagner brings out all the most unpleasant characteristics of Jews. Their pettiness, their, he went on, greed, someone like that. He says, and then he went on and he said, I only know, in my entire life, I've only known one Mima, and it is myself. So, the comment has to be understood as Mahler's own particular problem. The first act and the second act, the comparison between Mima and Siegfried is made in the starkest terms. But Wagner made some miscalculations in the role, and it's the reason that Siegfried is the least popular of the four ring operas, so I know some of the people here, Betty loves it most of all. But in terms of how many performances it gets, we're talking about how many performances the different operas get. And Siegfried by itself gets fewer than the rest. And the reason is various miscalculations, and it's about the relationship of Mima and Siegfried himself. That is, Siegfried's supposed to be a young adolescent boy. Nobody can sing that part unless they're a huge hunk of it. Okay? Now, who is he dealing with? This kind of, little dwarf. So you have this big guy in this bear skin and this little dwarf on the stage at the same time. And so one's sympathy, in fact, can go to the dwarf. Go to the dwarf. In fact, Wagner, I think Wagner's miscalculation was in part because he so loved the character of Siegfried. He really identified with Siegfried. When you love one of your characters too much, you might lose some perspective. Why did you love Siegfried so much? Siegfried has one question that he wants the answer to the first act and the second act as well. Where do I come from? Who is my father? Who is my father? Siegfried doesn't know who his father is. Wagner wasn't too sure of that either. And in Siegfried, we find this identification with himself. Even the character of Mima, M-I-M-E, Mima, mime in English, mime, actor. Ludwig Geyer, who was probably Wagner's biological father, was an actor. And Wagner never knew if Ludwig Geyer was Jewish or not. Nobody really seems to have a clear answer on it. It probably wasn't. That's not the point, though. Wagner didn't know. Wagner did not know. And so he identified with Siegfried so strongly that perhaps some proportion doesn't work in this opera. Thorn, I'd like to play Mima's lullaby, in which he sings, and in fact, one can totally sympathize with him. He says, look, I provided you with everything. And he did. You say Mima is a mean character. Well, Mima, if Siegfried is 16 years old, Mima did everything but die by him for 16 years. He did everything for this little girl. So here he sings, and the music that he sings is definitely not German music. That is, I can't say it's Yiddish music, but it sounds like an East European lullaby. I did for the very beginning. Let's start it over. I pressed the wrong button. Oh! I pressed the wrong button. There's no forgiveness if you press the wrong button. Well, we're hearing it. I'd like to hear it. Now, later in the act, in the forging scene, there's a really interesting moment in the forging scene, and I must admit that I haven't seen this written about anywhere. So what I'm sharing with you this evening, nobody else knows except us. Okay? Here it goes. Before we listen to the specific moments, I'd like us to listen to some Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was a Jewish composer, long dead by this time, but the one who Wagner was so jealous of because of his successes. Mendelssohn in the 1840s, when Wagner was in exile, the end of the middle 1840s, Wagner is in the midst of revolutionary activities in Dresden. What is Mendelssohn doing? In Wagner's hometown of Leipzig, Mendelssohn is the head of the Conservatory of Music. Ricardo is not happy. All right. So now we're going to listen to a little bit of Mendelssohn. It'll be familiar to you. And there are just certain aspects of the music that I'd like you to notice, which is the lightness of the music. Certainly, there's use of repetition let's say, introductory phrases, the notes in the introductory phrase. Here we go. We all know this music. Here comes, let me pause it for a moment. Here comes an excerpt from the violin concerto. Two quick excerpts from the violin concerto, and I think you'll see the relationship and technique with what we just heard. This. Going into the last movement. The lightness, the clarity, and the style. Here's a later moment in the same concerto. All right, so we're getting some Mendelssohn in our ears and the style of the Mendelssohn piece. All right, now we go to the forging scene, which throughout almost all of it, Siegfried is intent on what he's doing, which is recreating the sword of his father. But there's one moment when he stops and looks over there and says, "What's this blockhead doing about Mima?" And suddenly the spotlight is on Mima. He says, "What are you doing there with your pots and your pans?" And Mima says, "Well, I can't do much with a sword. I might as well become a cook." So I might as well become a cook. It's a little comic interlude. Listen to the music that Wagner writes. The music when the spotlight is suddenly on Mima. It doesn't sound like anything else in the ring.
ist beim An, denn aus, als auch die, wenn jetzt das Eisen bleibt.
Wagner is making fun of medicine. It's a parody of the music of medicine. And so we could say, yes, maybe there's that element in here, which is questionable that he was doing it, but it's being done in at least a comic spirit. I'd like to present to you, I'd like to mention, are there places in Wagner in which the dark spirit really comes out? Yes, there really are such places where you hear all that was possible within him. You know, Brian McGee and Owen Lee and others talk about Wagner as being, in a sense, too complete as a person. That is, experiencing and expressing everything. Everything from greatest love and passion, to feeling hatreds, dark energies. Now, this is in a sense tangential, because this has nothing to do with Jewish, Christian, or any of those other elements. It's here is the moment when Wotan comes in the third act of Die Walküre, after his daughter who was disobeyed him. There is more anger expressed in this music, more anger expressed in this music than I've ever heard in a piece of music before. So where does it come from? Where do you create music which is filled with anger without understanding it within yourself? Here it is. The real portrayal of evil in the rings, most definitely not Mima. And it's not Albert. The real portrayal of evil is not Albert's son, Hagen. Hagen's portrayal is the greatest example, I think, of the personification of evil on the stage, equaled maybe only by Shakespeare's Richard III. And I'll play one example of this, one section of this, which is when Hagen is calling the vassals to a celebration, wedding celebration. He's calling them. But if you listen to the music, listen to the absolute barbarism in the music, and the moving line for tubas and bass fiddles underneath the singer, it sounds like the music of a stalking beast. Going to track 7, final track.
Oh,
something frightening in the man. Who could imagine sounds like this? Next to this, Verdi's Iago sounds like a mischievous harlequin. Now, I'd like to go back now and conclude with looking at that possibility that Mima, going back to Mima for a moment, that Mima maybe is a Jewish character. Maybe Albert is a Jewish character. Maybe Loga, the lawyer, is a Jewish character. Going all these different people in the ring, they might be Jewish characters. What I'd like to suggest is that there is in Wagner a Jewish awareness. You see it first in the Flying Dutchman. The Wandering Jew, the Flying Dutchman. How many characters in his operas are like wandering Jews, from the Dutchman to Kundry? The reason that I'm leaving Kundry and Parsifal out of this whole thing is the Nazis left Parsifal out of the whole thing. They didn't want that opera to perform. They did not perform Parsifal. There was no great hero in Parsifal. It was too passive a man there. Parsifal was not performed with Wagner in the Hitler era. But this element of a Jewish awareness, I want to stick just to the ring. I'd like to read you. This is just a consideration that you might not have had before. I'm going to read from a story of Thomas Mann's called Blood of the Volsungs. In the midst of it, during it, he tells the story of the Valkyrie. And I'm going to read some excerpts from his retelling of that story. It's very accurate, but at the same time it's very subjective. And I've picked the spots that I wish to read, of course. Hunding, dull lout that he was, he saw their likeness, that self-same greed, that odd, untrammeled, rebellious stock which he hated, to which he felt inferior. Ziegler spoke. He told how he had been born with a twin sister, and as people who dare not speak out, he called himself by a false name. He gave a moving account of the hatred and envy which had been the bane of his life and his strange father's life. How they had led in the forest a harried, persecuted, outlawed existence. And then Siegmund sang the most painful thing of all, of yearning for human beings, his longing and ceaseless loneliness. A curse had laid upon him forever. He was marked by the brand of his strange origins. His speech had not been as others' speech, nor theirs as his. What he found good was vexation to them. He was galled by the ancient laws to which they paid honor. Always and everywhere he had lived among anger and strife. He had borne the yoke of scorn and hatred and contempt, all because he was strange, of a breed, kind, hopelessly different from them. Later in the act, Sieglinde related the heartbreaking tale of how they had forced her to give herself to the crude and savage Hunding, and to count herself lucky in an honorable marriage which might bury her dark origins in oblivion. Here's an excerpt from the final act. Brunhilde slept. She lay with her coat of mail and her shield on a mossy couch, ringed with fire and smoke, with leaping, dancing tongues, with magic, sleep, compelling fire music. But she had saved Sieglinde, in whose womb there grew and waxed the seed of that hated, unprized race, chosen of the gods from which the twins had sprung. If you're going to accept me as Jewish, they're all Jewish. They're all Jewish. Wotan is Jewish. His chosen people, the Volsungs are Jewish. Siegfried is Jewish. What we find in Wagner, we can really, in a sense, put that to the side and recognize there's an awareness of Jewishness is what's part of Wagner's psyche in his music, as well as the more pernicious part of it, which appears in his writings and in his personal life. And while he'll remain controversial, he'll always be controversial. He'll be controversial. The worst of this controversy is still in front of us, the year 2013. The year of celebration of the 200th anniversary of Wagner's birth will also be undoubtedly the year of the greatest revisionist outrage against performances of Wagner and tying him again with Hitler. Through our lifetime, this will exist. There is no question of that. We'll keep going on, get used to it. Hopefully it will diminish as time goes by. But forever he will be controversial, but it's for other reasons. It's right in the music itself. It's not in the fact of the music that, well, he used different harmonies or used different structures. That doesn't matter. After a while, everybody's harmonies are found and used, and all the structures have been tried, and the twilight is going to fall on all of the gods, if that's what it's about. But all of the other gods, the Mozart, and the Bach, and the Beethoven god, they can sleep quietly at night at twilight, because when they get up in the morning, we listen to them again, and it's music without controversy. But Wagner's music itself is filled with controversy. And it is, Brian McGee really stated it wonderfully, and I'll mention it, I think you'll all understand this thought. The key is this: Wagner gives expression to things that in the rest of us, and in the rest of art, are unconscious, because they're repressed. The process of growing, developing independent personalities, and learning to live in society, we have to subordinate some of the most powerful instinctual desires, especially erotic and aggressive ones. They are driven underground below the level of consciousness. It's this repression, this inner conflict, inseparable from living, and it's part of all of our personalities. I believe that it is from and through this level of personality that Wagner's music speaks. For some people, finding that in his music is this gift. It's as if we're finding some part of ourselves that we never recognized before. It's like falling in love. For other people, it is a gift. Now, I'll use the gift in terms of the German word gift. It's a poison. German word for poison is a gift. So what? Some people, most I hope, find a welcoming gift. There are others who will always be repelled to find it as poison, because they do not wish that part of themselves to be intruded upon by a stranger. And so we have to have mercy on all of these different opinions, and even all the things which you could say, this man, so huge, had these bad elements in it. Let's have mercy on him as well. The word for mercy in Hebrew is Rahmanas. So I say, have a little Rahmanas on God. Everyone, I thank you very much.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Saul, so much for that great presentation.
I really just, for those of you who got past the static, I thank you for doing that, and I'm sorry for it. I'm just so sorry for it. You know that Jim had suggested that I do the whole thing over again, but I'm sure you realize that this was in a sense an improvisation. That is, you noticed I didn't use notes except when I was quoting someone, and you realize the spot you can be in when you do that. That is, you know, you just do it, and you can't really do it twice, because the second time would have been, you know, a lie. The first time was what it was, which was thinking of all of these thoughts and sharing them with you. I'm grateful for all of you who hung on right to the end.
Well, thanks, Saul. Well, for the folks who are still with us, we are going to go ahead and open it up for questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and either write it in the Q&A box, or you can go ahead and put your hand up and we will call on you. So Saul, there is a question that someone wrote from Morris Goldings. Saul, since your lecture some years ago, have you observed any new developments on the subject of Wagner and Jewish matters you can share with us? That was from Morris Goldings.
Oh, Morris, thank you for that question. Something that some of you might find interesting. A few years ago, I was invited to Boston University to have a debate with Gottfried Wagner. Gottfried Wagner is the great-grandson of Wagner, And he's famous perhaps for one action which he took when he was a young man, which was he poured paint all over a statue of his great grandfather. And, and he hasn't changed as he grew older. And so he and I had a debate. And it was really an interesting experience. Beforehand, I read his book because he wrote a book about the way he felt. And it was interesting. I must tell you that I bought the book on, online, and it cost $3.02, I think it was. And the $3 was for postage, and the book itself only cost 2 cents. It was worth more than that. But I do mention that because Gottfried Wagner is a polemist and spends really, I think, the majority of his professional life going around the world trashing his great grandfather. And so there we were in Boston, and we had an interesting discussion. I presented him with a fact which it seems to me would be obvious, which was that if there had been no such composer named Richard Wagner, Adolf Hitler would still have followed the path which he followed, a desire to dominate the world, and the millions who were destroyed because of him. But if you take a switch and say, well, let's imagine if the composer had lived, but Adolf Hitler had never been born, well, I think Germany might still have resented the Versailles treatment, but I don't think anyone could possibly imagine the same maniacal path of hatred and destruction. So that's the most, Morris, I thank you for your question. That's the first thought which occurs to me, which is that time with I couldn't convince, you can be sure I could not convince Gottfried Wagner at all. In his book, he talked about how he grew up, he's about the same age as I am, how he grew up in the 1930s and 40s and watched the Luftwaffe bombing cities, and always the Ride of the Valkyries was playing, and he says that music is Nazi music. And I said, Gottfried, I heard that music when I was growing up also. And what I remembered it as was Elmer Fudd singing Kill the Wabbit. And so it all depends on the culture in which you live, which creates so much of your reaction to it. Thank you for that one, Morris.
Great, thank
Somebody
you.
else.
Yeah, sure. There's another.
I promise not to talk so long in response the next time.
So when was this lecture recorded?
Oh, it was just before 2013. Yes, it had to be just before that, because I mentioned right near the end that the 200th anniversary is coming up.
Okay.
Of his birth. Yeah.
Great. There's a question from Charlotte Newsberg. It's now 12 years since your lecture. Are the revisionists still going strong?
Yes, they are. I think what we have to realize is that it's an industry. That is, in fact, anyone today who wishes to write a book on Wagner, if he writes about anything else, has a very difficult time getting it published. That is, the revisionist world is the one which attracts authors. And so it is very strong. And I know of really a few different authors who have just tried to write books talking about the music, just talking about the music. Because today we don't listen with the same intensity with which perhaps in the late 19th century people did. And Wagner should be listened to in intensity, because every moment of what he wrote has meaning to it. And every moment, as he himself once wrote to Franz Liszt, he talking about the Ring, he asked Liszt to notice that every measure, every phrase was a consequence of the music and the phrase which came just before it. And that intensity of musical thought is almost really foreign to a contemporary way of listening to music, in which we think of it as, just more if we sit back and we shall be entertained. But great music, not just Wagner, but great music there's so much more for us than entertain us. It just, fills our life with part of what it's like to be alive.
Thank you, Saul. From Adrian Hoffman. Thank you for your passionate talk. Are you aware of Joachim Keller's book, Wagner's Hitler? I was lent a copy and I'm proud to say that it does not remain, I think, in the library.
I don't know the book.
Okay.
No, I'm not aware of the book.
Okay.
Is it part of the industry, the pernicious industry?
Let's see what their response is. And if anyone wants to speak, just go ahead and raise your hand and we can patch you into Saul. Another question, Saul, was Cosima more of an anti-Semite than her husband? Cosima, excuse me.
Yeah. Cosima was such an anti-Semite that Richard looks like a rabbi next to her.
Oh boy.
And she is, to me, one of the least attractive people in music history. Cosima, of course, was Gottfried Wagner's great-great-grandmother. And it's unfortunate that Cosima did not, have a little bit more of her own father in her personality. Cosima's own father was Franz Liszt.
Great. Thank you, Saul. Let's see. Any other question? We had a comment from Sabrina. Spectacularly interesting and dense lecture. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. That's from Sabrina.
Sabrina, I appreciate that so much.
And
I always love it when we're as a group together, and I'm sitting next to Betty, and you're just 2 seats over to my right.
there you go. Joanne Whitney said, I have the book, which I bought for a great deal more at the San Francisco Opera. So
Which book? Godfrey's book?
I don't know. She didn't say. Maybe.
Oh, you mean the book you were talking about before?
Yes.
No, I meant, can you mention something about it? Tell us about the book, about the viewpoint, let's say, of the author.
Here's Joanne right now. Joanne, go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Yes, it's Godfrey's book, and it was really kind of funny. It was so ridiculous in some ways, but oh gosh, it has to be 20, 30 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the book was published.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember buying it, and it probably, I looked at I couldn't get into my bookcase. I have a whole bookcase full of Wagner, but I remember it well because it just went on and on and on and on and on. Question, what do you say to those people who say, okay, there was no overt characterization in any of the characters, but it was subtly there, not even perhaps that Wagner himself knew what he was doing?
There's no words that can convince people of something which is so deeply felt. And I mentioned at the end of my talk that I think we do also, have to have understanding and mercy, rachmanis, the Hebrew word, rachmanis, on those who feel otherwise. I have no rachmanis for the ones who are making their living trashing a great composer. That should not be the function of anyone who loves music, to trash a composer. So
it's shocking to me that this is still going on.
Well, the thing is that
who buys these diatribes?
They are. I'm not sure of exactly what their audience is, but the thing is that what the audience might expect, their audience might expect, is that a great genius, any of the truly great geniuses in Wagner, belongs with them, who astounds us with, profound insights. They expect for them to be able in their personal lives to be just as good, but none of them are. They're not perfect people. Wagner is not a perfect person. And so that expectation is simply, we expect too much. We expect otherwise. So you say, can you separate a great artist from his private life? Well, what Wagner did, Wagner once wrote about the he wrote very little about how he composed music. but he did say, you have no idea what it's like to just be sitting at the loom. Sit at the loom. In other words, when there is nothing but art on his mind. And that moment, that precious moment for him is what he has created for us.
Great. Thank you, Saul. Thanks you, Joanne. From Steve Schaefer, Wake Forest. Jacob Katz wrote a book on Wagner's anti-Semitism, The Darker Side of Genius. Katz agrees that reading anti-Semitism into Wagner's music is an after-the-fact viewpoint, but he claims that Wagner's anti-Semitism, including the timing of his publication and republication of his essay, was out of step with the waves of anti-Semitism that went through Europe in the 19th century. Do you have a sense of that? Perhaps the publications were a matter of attracting attention? Question mark.
Wagner had the habit of writing whatever he was thinking about. And so I don't think his concern was being out of step with it or not. I think we could probably say that he brought upon himself the worst publicity which he has been afflicted with. But remember, of course, that if it hadn't been for, let's say, the trick, the nasty trick that history has played on him and, of course, on all of us, which was the Nazi regime and all that they did, we wouldn't care that he was just one more anti-Semite in the middle of the 19th century. It was loaded with them. It's almost hard to find an important artist of the time who wasn't in some fashion or other finding something terrible to say about Jews or Gypsies, or if they were Germans, saying about French or vice versa. It's a factor in, human nature to look at the other, and disparage him. We're going through that and recognizing it perhaps for the first time, how great it is in our own country and our racial problems. Just imagine that for hundreds and hundreds of years, more than just a few hundred years. This was an attitude throughout Europe about those people who were different, who didn't accept their religion, who kept to their ways and their languages, and they hated them because of it. It's not the best of human nature, but it exists.
Thank you, Saul. We've got George Cicchetti. Go ahead and unmute yourself, George.
Hello, Saul.
Hi, George, unmute yourself, yes.
Did I? Okay.
I hear you.
Betsy and I, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay, very good. Betsy and I are here enjoying your presentation, and it's always great to catch up with you. I have a question regarding, not exactly on the subject regarding the Jewish, but I've always been fascinated that most of Wagner's opera shows, and we know the redemption of women in one form or another. Is that something that was by accident, or was Wagner really that focused on seeing how man can be influenced and redeemed by the influence of a woman?
Yeah, you had me, you threw me a loop for a while because you said redemption of women, but you mean redemption by women.
Redemption by women.
Wagner did believe that. That is, let's put it another way. Wagner recognized, George, what you and I and most men sooner or later realize is that the let's say the power of women, the redeeming power of women in our lives is absolutely extraordinary. And Wagner was truly aware of this. And there is about him almost, you could say, a worship of the power of women. And I look at, take a look at, for instance, one that we think of as, not a powerful woman, Eva in Meistersinger. She begins as a little, flirty girl. She becomes more coquettish in the second act. And by the third act, she suddenly realizes who Hans Sachs has been all her life. And in front of our eyes, she blossoms out and she becomes an Isolde. And it's just absolutely the richness of the woman, which Wagner exalts in the magnificent music, which he gives her to sing. It's a very difficult part to sing because you've got to be a different woman in the third act from the child that you were in the first.
In that opera, it's somewhat subtle, but in some of them it's very emphatic, you know. In Dutchman and surely in the Ring, you have this female character that is very prominent and very focused in the climax.
Well, if you look at, I think you're right, and if you look, for instance, at Die Walküre, look at the name itself, Die Walküre. I could give you another name. Die Walküre equals Brunhilde. That opera could have been called Brunhilde.
Sure.
Even though she doesn't appear until almost midway through the second act. Even though the final scene is one which, for the last 10 minutes or so, she doesn't sing. Her father sings and the orchestra sings, and yet it in fact is a recognition at that point that if there's going to be redemption in this world, it's going to come from that woman. Wotan can't do it. Only that woman can do it. So Wagner's deep recognition of that factor in women, plus the fact that he was also, let's say, sexually, not just sexually active, but, let's say sexually driven through his life, through this love of the woman. All of these combined.
Thank you.
Carry on. I'm wondering if because of all the static at the beginning, everybody dropped out except the 4 or 5 people
No,
who I'm talking with now. I hope there are more of you out there.
There's 80 people on, so we're good.
Did they hang on? Did you hang on? It got clearer after a while.
The Wagnerians, they hold on for hours. Here's John Middlesworth question. He goes, you spoke to the historic portrayal of Beckmaster as a Jewish figure. Do you have any similar information on portraying Mima as Jewish?
Well, I don't have photographic information of it, and I don't see that being done in the same fashion as it was done with Beckmaster. In that Beckmaster's role in Meistersinger, which is so important through the entire opera as the antagonist, was the one in which those directors of opera since 1949, 1950 zeroed in on as the character in which they could create a Jewishness, and in which they worked on it. You could say in Beckmaster, in Mima, that little folk melody which he sings, that lullaby, well, that almost sounds Jewish. So it might be that, as I mentioned, yes, Mima is very likely a character that Wagner created in which a Jewishness is created within the character itself. You can say, well, what is it? Does he act in some way which is, or is he treated in some way which is similar to what we consider the German-Jewish relationship? Well, there is Siegfried who kills him. I don't know why Siegfried had to kill him. It's in the Nordic myth, of course, that Siegfried kills Mima, but he didn't have to kill Mima. I mean, I'm sorry Wagner went along with the myth, because Mima has no power, because Siegfried can read all of his thoughts. If you can read someone else's thoughts, that person has no power over you. I would have preferred it much more if Siegfried just kind of kicked him off the stage, just like kicked him into the orchestra pit. That would let Mima go running through the house, screaming, to the back of the house. That would have been a better way to portray him. But you say, well, he didn't do that, and so is it a Jewish character? I say, yeah, not as Jewish as Fagin is in Charles Dickens. It's not as Jewish as Shylock is, Shakespeare. It's not as Jewish as the look of, in Mussorgsky's pictures in an exhibition, of the one picture which is called Shmuel and Goldenberg. And so the fact is, why is it that the other people have gotten away with it? And there's one spot in Wagner, which is very likely a Jewish character. Why did he get away with it? Well, we know history. He didn't get away with it because history itself has placed that stain upon Wagner because of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. If there had been no Hitler, we wouldn't give a damn about just, one more element of anti-Semitism in the 19th century.
Thank you, Saul. There's just a comment from Ben Sherbin. He goes, yes, we hung on. It was amazing. So that's from Ben.
Oh, I'm so glad you hung on. Oh, I'm so glad you did.
And now we've got a question from
all of you did. I'm sorry for the static. I saw maybe Jim was right. I should have done it all over again. But if I did it all over again, it would have been, it couldn't have been, just talking as I was able to do. And I was so glad to be able to do that.
There's a question.
Really thank you all.
Thanks, Saul. Betty Byrne, go ahead.
Hello, Betty, dear.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Betty.
Betty, talk to me.
He's gonna.
Hello?
There you go.
Oh, Betty.
Yeah. I wanted to comment. When you first gave that lecture, my God, centuries ago now, Saul.
Centuries ago? What was I, a child? Oh,
15 years ago.
No. I think it was 11, but carry on. Go ahead.
I was doing the publicity, and I thought it would be interesting to visit various synagogues around town to tell them about the lecture. And those that let me in, of course, once I mentioned that it was a Wagner lecture, but those that did were very interesting. My comment was, this is a lecture by someone who is Jewish. In fact, someone who celebrates Friday nights. And he's giving a lecture that is about Wagner's music and the Jews. And I think you all may be very interested. I think we had quite a few people from various synagogues who came to some of those lectures. And I thought people might be interested to know that that indeed did happen.
I really appreciate you mentioned that. That Jewish audiences have always loved Wagner. That, when the Ring cycle in 1876, when it closed, closing night, and Wagner was brought up on stage, the person who brought him on stage, I don't remember the man's name, but he was the head of the Berlin Wagner Society, which was the largest Wagner society in the world at the time. And he thanked Wagner, and the two men hugged each other. I mean, that man was Jewish. He was Jewish. That Berlin Wagner Society was made up of Jews. Our Wagner Society in Washington has many Jewish members in it. And we find this really continuously, that there's been this strong connection between Wagner and Wagner's music and Jewish audiences. And Wagner himself, that is the only man that he trusted the Ring to, performing the Ring, was the Jewish producer named Angelo Neumann. Angelo Neumann took the Ring to Russia, all different places in Eastern Europe. That was the man that Wagner trusted with his music. Wagner himself, his connection with Wagner's connection with lots of people, we could say that he was a very self-centered man, and always know, is the connection because of friendship, is because he needs their help, that's always there with him. His close friend in Munich, aside from Ludwig, of course, was a man named Pringsheim. Pringsheim was the largest supporter of Wagner. He was a Jewish businessman in Munich, and he helped Wagner with the Bayreuth Festspielhaus. By the way, Pringsheim's daughter married Thomas Mann, and Thomas Mann's wrote one of his stories, The Blood of the Volsungs, which is really about the Springsteen family. Hello? Did I answer your question? Probably not, but I meant to.
Thanks, Doug.
I meant to. I miss you, Betty. You got
Yes.
saving a seat right next. I always sit right next to Betty.
realize,
Might be
yeah,
2 seats
yeah,
away from
yeah.
Sabrina, but I'm always right next to Betty.
The other thing is, right after that lecture, I was in Bayreuth, and they had just formed a Wagner Society in Tel Aviv. And I brought along a copy of your lecture, which I, of course, gave to the Tel Aviv Wagner Society.
I really hope they enjoyed it.
Oh,
And they recognized it.
sure they did.
You know, and that I recognize, even as I mentioned at the start of the talk, which we heard this evening, that I can understand, especially for those people who have memories as childhood of seeing their parents marched off to their deaths while the loudspeakers would play the Prelude to Demise to Singer. I can understand why they should not have to hear that music. It's not Wagner's fault, but it certainly isn't theirs. And so I can understand the ban of Wagner's music in Israel as a kindness to the survivors and their children. And that time will pass by. And then the just value is what will matter. The great value of these artworks, which are among the finest ever written.
All right, thank you. All right, we're going to move on. Thank you, Betty. Marilyn Wong, I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to let you talk, but I see you have 2 questions, so I'm going to give you the option to either ask here or I can ask for you.
You go for it. I'll light my pipe.
Marilyn Wong, are you there?
Hello, thank you so much, Saul. I have to thank you and Jim Holman and the Wagner Society, because before I came to Washington in 1996, I didn't really know much about Wagner. I think I had just heard Meistersinger because we played the overture in the Mount Holyoke Orchestra. I was a violist at the time, and it was a very rousing thing. But to hear the Ring in its completed form and the marathon that Jim had, and hear it live with Philippe Augain during that whole period, I think I came of age musically. So I want to thank you, but I want to question, my question is, you spoke about, the discussion was about man being redeemed by woman or a faithful woman. And I wondered what you thought about Kundry, because I think she's often misunderstood. And the interpretation of Kundry is important in Parsifal, and yet she's often neglected. So I wondered what you thought of that role and whom you thought was one of the greatest Kundries.
Well, I'm only sorry that Wagner gave Kundry, I think, only one, 2 notes to sing in the last act, because the character is one of Wagner's greatest creations.
Yes.
Especially that scene in the second act, the seduction, you could say, the seduction of Parsifal scene. I love the Waltraud Meyer, by the way. I think she was wonderful. She sang it beautifully, and she was sexy. And you have to have a sexy Kundry. Okay. If you don't have a sexy Kundry, you've got to listen to it on a CD. The thing is that what I'd love to see on the stage, because when she sings "Es ein Kind," you know, when I saw you as a little child, I could imagine this scene with Parsifal on her lap as a child sucking at her breast. I really think that's the way the scene should be done. It's never done that way, but good Lord, I think it would be wonderful.
Well, you put it on a plate, and I hope someone putting on a production of Parsifal will do it. That was one of her early roles, right?
Not likely. You know, I'm a dirty old fan.
No. Nursing, for any mother who has nursed a child, it is a lovely feeling.
I know that. Yes. I know that. And that is really that that scene, that's the way that scene begins.
Thank
Just as if just as if he's nursing, he's in her lap, she's cradling him, and she's nursing him. Yeah, it would be wonderful.
Thank you, Marilyn. All right, let's see. There was a question. Bonnie Becker, one of my favorites. She's not a question, she's a comment. You made the right decision not to try to duplicate her production that had an enthusiasm and energy that would have been impossible to duplicate. So that was from Bonnie.
Thank you, Bonnie. That's the way I mean, Jim's suggestion was a valuable suggestion and a valid one, but that's just the point which I know could not have been replicated. But I didn't know about that static. I just had no idea. I don't know where that microphone was, but the one that was, around my neck wasn't working.
All right. Well, looks like Morris Golding's has a question. He goes, tell us a bit of Leonard Bernstein and Wagner.
Leonard Bernstein did not conduct too much Wagner, but when he did, he was like worshiping at the feet. Bernstein had even said that he considered Tristan and Isolde to be the single most important piece of music in the history of Western music. And so, by the way, his recording of Tristan is it's very slow, but it's very wonderful. Later in Bernstein's life, his tempi got slower and slower. But a lot of people grew up listening to Hans Knappertsbusch, who's the slowest of all, I think, of the Wagner conductors. So Bernstein is in that company. He was a wonderful Wagner conductor, but Wagner was not his specialty. I think what Bernstein conducted better than anything else, other than contemporary music, actually, was the music of Haydn. You listen to Bernstein doing the Haydn Symphony, for some reason or other, everything clicked. Mozart, not as well. Haydn was the one.
Great, thank you, Saul.
Thank you, Morris.
Let's see, not too many more questions. A lot of enthusiastic thanks to you, Saul, but we don't have any more questions. So
that's all right. I'm glad of the enthusiasm. I'm glad some people stuck around. And when it began, I was just mortified. And I said, oh, good Lord, because there were those notices from people saying, can't hear it, too much static, this and that. And people had suggestions, turn up this, turn down that.
They're helpful.
So it meant that whatever I said at the beginning, who remembers anymore, but whatever it was, maybe nobody heard it. Life goes on. I'll deal with that.
Yes, thank you so much, Saul. That was great.
Thank you all so much.
Yes, and for everyone out there, please join us for our next webinar on the 6th with Jeffrey Swan. That'll be
get that microphone good and close to you.
We're going to get it good and close, and it's going to be
Jeffrey deserves it.
So thank you, everyone. Have a great night. And this recording should be up in a day or so. So if you want to revisit it, it will be up on the website. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you. And thank you for your work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.